Okay, well, good afternoon again, everybody, and thank you for coming back in, as I said, in reasonable time. We'll begin. Could we close the doors, please? And we'll make some progress. I certainly won't be talking at any length, but I just thought it would be worthwhile picking up. I don't think the name Elon Musk has been mentioned so far, but somehow he's become a bit of a folk hero in recent years, not only for developing electric cars, but for developing battery storage in a considerable scale in the States. And one can't help but feel that in the context of this afternoon session, demand and supply, where the intermittency of energy is often quoted as being a failure of alternatives to provide, that the history of battery storage will be very much the future. And I was reading recently that in Sweden now, grants are being given to houses with solar to provide, I think, 60% of the costs of the battery storage. So it's a direction of travel, I think, that we need to be mindful of. But again, there's always a danger when I try and convene things that one takes the thunder, steals the thunder of other speakers. So I'm going to hand over now to Paul. Paul Dorfman, I mentioned at the outset this morning of the very many names that come across my desk on a regular basis. I don't think there's anybody more prevalent in my correspondence, email correspondence, and a very welcome one than Paul himself, who clearly has his finger on the pulse of so many aspects of nuclear energy. So could I hand you over to Paul, please? Thank you.
Thank you, and I'm very pleased to chair this session, which involves, this collection of enormously expert and knowledgeable participants. Let me first introduce Andrew Warrren, founder director of the Association for the Conservation of Energy, special advisor to House of Commons Environment Select Committee, served as special advisor to 4 EC Energy Commissions, former IBC Energy Journalist of the Year. Andrew is now chairman of the British Energy Efficiency Federation.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you, Paul, for that introduction. I'm going to actually begin by also repeating what was just said about my delight at being able to share a platform with Paul Dorfman, who I think, particularly over the last decade, has been one of the most influential academics working in this area that I've ever come across. He's also enormously competent at answering emails, which isn't always something true of every academic. I also want to pay tribute to Ian Fairlie, who I have known for a number of years, and I never thought it would actually be possible to put this thing together, and I suspect it wouldn't have been put together without Ian's remarkable tenacity. So again, I'd like you to pay tribute to Ian, who is at the back there, and who's going to wave at us. I've got this fascinating slot just after you've gorged yourself al fresco of bringing you down to earth, because I'm actually not going to talk to you about renewables. I'm going to take instead a theme which, having heard Kelvin Hopkins talk about something happened 37 years ago, something that I do recall happening with a select committee. It wasn't one, actually, that I was advising at the time, but the Select Committee on Energy 35 years ago to this day, Ian, I checked, came up with a report on energy policy. And I ought to get this right, so I'm going to actually read to you. They said, "It is a national scandal that we are due to be spending £1.3 billion on a new nuclear plant at Sizewell when we do not know whether that is more cost-effective than spending a similar sum on reducing energy consumption." I have to say that national scandal, as far as officialdom is concerned, still exists, because there has been no attempt at all across the last 35 years or so to answer that question, possibly because the idea of only spending £1.3 billion on building a nuclear power station is quite beyond us now. We're talking about, whatever it is, 24 billion euros on building Hinkley. What I do know is that the cost of delivering better energy saving, whether it's better windows, better boilers, better fabric insulation, better lighting and so forth, is all of it really, in real terms, no more expensive than it was then. So we're actually saying, what's the difference between spending 24 billion euros on a new nuclear power station or even just 1.3 billion on energy efficiency? And I think what we've found is that actually the real world knows that it's the latter rather than the former which tends to deliver. One of the things that I was saying, and I remember David Toke saying in the earlier session, is that there has been quite an impact upon overall demand for electricity. I have a thing that I like to do with brand new officials or new ministers, and there is now a new minister covering climate change and energy, one Claire Perry. Well, she'd be known in her own household at any rate, even if she isn't known here. But I haven't yet had the opportunity to ask her this question, but it's not, I might even try it out on you, in fact, which is to say to you, what do you think has happened to consumption levels of electricity in this country over the last decade or so? And I remind people that actually we've seen GDP increase by 13% in compound terms over that period. And we've also seen, haven't we, enormous expansion in the number of gadgets, electricity-consuming gadgets that people have in their homes. And people spending time online, which 10 years ago they probably wouldn't have been, again consuming electricity. So what do you think's actually happened to demand for electricity over this period? And you normally get a sort of, well, I suppose, if GDP's gone up, it'd probably be at least, well, that's 13%. And of course, there are all these extra gadgets and stuff. And, well, I don't know. I mean, at least 15% or so assumption. And I say, well, strangely enough, back in 2005, 2006, when we suddenly changed from a policy which almost everyone seems to have forgotten. In 2003, we had an energy white paper which basically said renewables and energy efficiency is going to be the answer. Nuclear isn't going to count. That was the policy when we had Patricia Hewitt at the DTI and Margaret Beckett at Environment. I just to remind you of that. And at that point, we then had an election in 2005 and a brand new Secretary of State coming in to look after energy policy, Alan Johnson. Now, I don't know how many of you have been reading Alan Johnson. He's just literally retired from Parliament this month. Reading his autobiography. There are 3 volumes, and they are very readable indeed. And the last of them, they're all given Beatles songs as titles, and the last of them is called The Long and Winding Road. And he doesn't spend a lot of time on the detail of politics on things, and he was only in charge of energy policy at the DTI for about 10 months or so. But it's almost as a sort of throwaway line. He puts in that he was immediately greeted, all the stuff relating to industry, but what he was immediately greeted with was civil servants saying, the policy that you got from Margaret Beckett and Patricia Hewitt is rubbish. What we need is lots more nuclear. Why, he says in his autobiography, why do we need all these? Well, that's because electricity demand is going to go up enormously. It'll go up at least 15% in the next decade. Because, I mean, look what's happening on GDP that will probably be more than that. Now, in practice, he said he found that a very convincing argument. And I have to say, it's an argument which I have heard, and I've been with Paul Dorfman seeing subsequent successors in charge of energy policy in this country, and all of whom have been parroting this line of ever-increasing demand for electricity. They were talking about doubling, even tripling by 2050, which is the magic date when we're going to have achieved nearly zero carbon in terms of emissions. But there's going to be enormous demand for extra electricity. But in practice, let's just look at what has actually happened during this past 10 years. And the answer is that it hasn't gone up 15%. It's actually gone down, I'm going to get the figures exactly right, by 15.2%. The amount of electricity consumed, and I'll read you out the figures, about 2005 it was 29,981 KTOE, kilowatt tons of electricity. By 2015 it had come down from that figure, which is just under 30,000, to 26,031. That is a 15.2% drop. Now, it's not as much of a drop as there has been in gas sales. Natural gas sales have gone down by, to all intents and purposes, 1/3, 32% over the same period. Now, I don't see any energy planning at all which is being taken place by governments recognizing, or certainly by the present government or its predecessor, recognizing that this is actually a trend which has been happening now for quite a long while. That 2003 white paper was the first energy white paper since just after, and I think there are enough people in this audience who might even remember this, just after the 3-day week and the Yom Kippur War and everything like that. And if you look back to that period, and I'm talking about before we went to the 3-day week, but the sort of consumption we had in, say, 1970, and the consumption levels now, and the fact that actually our wealth as a country has tripled during that period, we are consuming far less fuel now than we were then. And so I ask the question, with an awful lot of this, we have justified swinging back in that 2005-2006 energy white paper into saying we've got to have this enormous amount of nuclear power. You've heard Professor Steve Thomas talking about the exact figures, and I feel I ought to get them right for his benefit of what we were going to be like to be spending. 125 billion plus 1/3 on the finance costs extra. Yeah, that we were going to move that way because there was going to be this enormous demand for electricity. All I can say is that without actually very much push from government, and certainly not very much push in the last 5 years or so from government, the real world has started to acknowledge the fact that energy consumption does not follow GDP growth. It isn't a matter of the sort of machismo thing that Donald Trump thinks it should be, that we should be consuming as much as possible. That actually the real world has altered sufficiently so that we are using far, far less. I tell you one obvious area on electricity, and I looked at the figures on this, which was relating to the key area. I mean, Andy Blowers used the expression about, always have this expression, will the lights go out without nuclear? Well, I looked at what had happened with electricity consumption on lighting in homes. In 1990, again, just a few figures for you immediately after lunch to show, we were using 26.6 terawatt hours. By 2010, we were down to 19.3. Last year, we were down to 14.2. In other words, over that period, and most of that has actually happened in the last 10 to 12 years or so, we've halved the amount of electricity used on lighting. The reason for that, incidentally, is because we moved initially to compact fluorescent light bulbs, rather clunky things, now into LEDs. But I'm going to leave you with the thought that one of the things that the great proponents of Brexit want to see is getting rid of all this red tape. And they want us to go back to blue passports. They want us to go back to having carrots and potatoes sold to us in pounds. I was going to say pounds, shillings and pence, but pounds as opposed to kilos. And they want to bring back 19th century incandescent light bulbs. They do. All you have to do is, I know most people here were avid readers of the Daily Express and the Daily Mail, and so there's been endless campaigns to try to do this. Oliver Letwin has now set up a committee which includes Labour MPs like Frank Field on it. Well, I believe he's a Labour MP. Perhaps you can tell me different. But it includes people ostensibly from all parties. So the former editor of the Daily Telegraph, there's a nice unbiased journalist. But their job is to deliver some easy hits during the Brexit period. And guess what they're going to try and do? It is to start looking at things like lighting, things like washing machine standards, refrigerating standards, and get rid of them because we don't need this because the marketplace will deliver. The marketplace has delivered a certain amount, but it has needed augmenting, basically by rules made in Europe. And so it has been good news, this. I am concerned that it doesn't necessarily remain so. I'm going to conclude, Paul, by just giving one further figure. When we started talking about the numbers of people employed in this area, there is, and I again cite Ian Fairlie in the Ecologist magazine this week, there is an article showing where the jobs are in the energy field. And as we've heard, it's much more in the renewables than it is in nuclear. But where the jobs certainly have been is in the manufacture of things like light bulbs and insulants and better windows and so forth. That's where the jobs have been. The frightening thing, and I'm going to leave on a slightly downbeat note, is that in the last 3 years, the number of people employed in manufacturing, distributing, installing energy-saving measures has dropped by almost 50%. So we've had a triumph, but we're going to have to fight hard to hold on to it. Thanks very much indeed for your time.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for that very, very interesting discussion. Can I now introduce Professor Tom Burke, the chairman of E3G, Third Generation Environmentalism,